a kind of cool-ish Tuesday in Northwest Iowa. Today, I'm going to share with you, not so long ago, I pre-ordered a book by one of my favorite authors of all time, and it recently arrived in the mail, and so I'm kind of like binge reading it. I know some people binge watch, I'm binge reading, and it is by Brene Brown, Braving the Wilderness. And so yesterday, I was reading a chapter. I think it's early on, and well, I know it's early on in the book, but what struck me is that it's about connection and belonging. That's what the whole book is about. And so I'm just going to share with you some of my favorite parts and keep those hearts coming because it lets me know that I'm not alone in this. Okay, so anything that strikes a chord with you, go ahead and give me a heart or some likes so that I know it's kind of like a high five, amen, sister, which I love. So I'm going to start out by talking about what she says is the heart and soul of connection, which starts with spirituality. Now, she might be talking about spirituality in the general sense of the word, but I always think of it in the specific sense of the word because I'm a lover of Christ in all things. And I love the fact that research and science is catching up to the ways that God has made known and plain for a very long time. So she defines spirituality as this. Spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us. I'd call that God. And that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and in compassion. Spirituality is the center point. It is the fact that we are all connected by a power greater than all of us. So, we're going to talk about a topic today that isn't such a fun one to talk about. In fact, in my clinical work, very few people show up at their clinical assessment saying that they are this. They might say that they are depressed or that they are anxious or that they are overwhelmed, but very few people come into my clinical practice saying, I am just really lonely. But in fact, when I start to hear their narrative, their story, loneliness pops everywhere. Loneliness pops everywhere. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about is I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump ahead and talk about, so I'm trying to talk and flip pages at the same time. What Brene Brown is, she's a researcher. She studies people and she studies trends of behavior. She studied things like vulnerability and shame, which I know they're exciting, right? All you have to do is Google search Brene Brown, Brene Brown, in a Google search and look up her TED Talks and you will be blown away. I promise you. She's so engaging. But when she's talking about loneliness, she's saying that we as a people group have gotten really good about sorting ourselves into who is like us and who is different. Who is like us in terms of our politics, and therefore kind of this us versus them mentality. Who is like us in terms of our religious beliefs. Who is like us in terms of our even our sports teams, right? It's kind of this us versus them mentality. And what people would presume is that this sorting would actually create a sense of unity, right? And there would be a less pervasive sense of loneliness. But in fact, the opposite is true. At the same time that sorting is on the rise in our country, so is loneliness. So is loneliness. She says in 1980, approximately 20% of Americans reported feeling lonely. Today, it's more than double that percentage. And this is not just a local issue. Rates of loneliness are rapidly increasing in countries around the world. I'd like to tell you, and this is true, did you know that there are some countries, especially on the continent of Africa, where the word loneliness doesn't even exist because they live in such inextricable community with one another that there's no context for loneliness to exist. But in our country and several other countries around the world, loneliness is spreading like hotcakes. Okay, let's talk more. There's a neuroscience researcher, John Capaccio, of the University of Chicago. He's been studying loneliness for over 20 years, and he defines it as perceived social isolation. Basically, we experience loneliness when we feel disconnected. At the heart of loneliness is the absence of meaningful social interaction, such as an intimate relationship, friendships, family gatherings, or even community or work group connections. Here she makes the differentiation because loneliness and being alone are not the same thing. Many people are actually fed by having some time being alone, and they don't feel lonely. They actually need a little break from people. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're introverted. Loneliness, however, is a feeling sense of an absence of meaningful social interaction. There's something missing and you know it. You may not pinpoint what it is. Now, in Brené Brown's household, her family has coined a term that they call the lonely feeling. And they have said that you can have the lonely feeling not only when you're with a crowd of people, which is essentially, I think, and Brené would say, the worst form of loneliness, when you're in a crowd of people and feel ultimately alone and have the lonely feeling, but can also be tied to a place where you expect to have disconnection from other people. The interesting thing about this is that the researcher says that as a member of social species, we don't derive strength from our rugged individualism, but rather from our collective ability to plan, communicate, and work together. Our neurons work better, our genetics make better when we are in a supportive interdependence versus independence. Let's talk a little more. This I found was really interesting. Our own biological machinery of our brains warns us when our ability to thrive and prosper is threatened. Hunger is a warning that our blood sugar is low and we need to eat. Thirst warns us that we need to drink to avoid dehydration. Pain alerts us to potential tissue damage, and loneliness is as critical as all of these. It tells us that we need social connection, something as critical to our well-being as food and water. Denying you feel lonely makes no more sense than denying you feel hunger. Let that sink in. Unchecked loneliness. What happens when we have unchecked loneliness that continues year after year after year? It fuels continued loneliness by keeping us afraid to reach out, keeping us more stuck. They drive the point even further. If you find yourself questioning the idea that starvation and loneliness are equally life-threatening, let me share the study that really brought all of this together. In a meta-analysis of studies, so many analysis of studies across several studies on loneliness, researchers that she names found the following. Living with air pollution increases your odds of dying early by 5%. Living with obesity, 20%. Excessive drinking, 30%. And living with loneliness, it increases our odds of dying early by 45%. So why in the world are we so lonely? This is where I think the answer isn't as hard as we might think. I think the underlying origin of loneliness is fear. Fear of being vulnerable, fear of being seen, fear of being rejected, fear of making our real self known to someone else and not being good enough or invisible. I know that's been my fight that I've spoken about for a long time, is fear of being invisible. But ultimately, it's fear. So what are we going to do about it? What are we to do about it? This is when I have hard conversations with people across from myself in my office. This is when I have hard conversation with my own self in front of the mirror. Because the only option of combating loneliness is to actually become active, to actually do things that are scary. You see, we have to find our way back to one another, or fear wins. It requires great vulnerability and the willingness to choose courage over comfort. It requires us to stand up, to reach out, to lean in, to open up, to walk forward. It requires us at every age and stage of life to put ourselves and our own insecurities out there, but essentially we have to do the thing. We have to do the thing. We can't talk our way around it. We can't make enough excuses. Eventually we have to actually take action. And that is really hard. And that is what Live Loved, the hashtag Live Loved, is all about. Knowing that we are in a country that is the most disconnected, isolated, and lonely, and fearful that we have really ever been. And the only medicine and hope, I would dare say, is for individuals to say, fear's not going to win. I am not going to self-isolate and shut down. I'm going to be deliberate in doing the direct opposite thing. I'm going to remember that there is a point of connection, going back to what she said at the very beginning. What is spirituality? Spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to one another by a power, by a God, by love, who is greater than all of us. And that our connection to that power, to God, to love, and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. And I'm going to live as if that belief were true, because it is true, even when I'm not feeling it, even when my mind is disputing it. I'm going to live it full out loud anyway. Thoughts on a Tuesday. If you don't have this lovely read by Brené Brown, I highly encourage you to get your booty onto Amazon and order it. You will be blessed. I'm going to keep on chugging through it. It's full of goodness. It's full of good news, and it's full of challenge. Anyway, have a great day, guys. Much love to you. Live loved on purpose. We'll be right back.